series for this semester. I am Dr. Dawn Dow, the Faculty Director of the Critical Race Initiative, and we are so pleased that so many of you have chosen to join us for this reconfigured version of the symposium that typically occurs in the spring semester. We are also grateful to the panelists for this session, but also the panelists across the semester who have been willing to be flexible with their schedules and in our re-envisioning of the symposium as a series of panels over the fall semester. I also want to thank all of the units around campus who have co-sponsored this event and appeared on the opening slide. Those units and organizations include MICA, the Organization of Graduate Diversity and Inclusion, Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Consortium for Race, Gender, and Ethnicity, School of Public Policy, the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Department of Government and Politics, African American Studies Department, the U.S. Latino Studies Program, MLAW Programs Department of American Studies, the College of Education, the Center for Global Migration Studies, Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, the School of Public Health, the College of Behavioral Science, the Department of Sociology, and the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. CRR would also like to extend our thanks to the Singleton, McAllister, and Craig Thompson Foundations for their support of research collaborations between students and faculty. We are grateful for all of these campus units for their continued support. We are at an important inflection point in our society that presents an opportunity for progressive change. We are at a moment when using critical race theory and intersectionality as frameworks for examining systemic racism and structural inequality, and to produce strategies to address ongoing systemic and structural and racial inequality is essential to the health of our country and the globe. Finally, I'd like to thank the RAs who have helped to make this symposium possible. Over the 2019-2020 academic year, Simone Durham and Robin Moore, Sydney Yarbrough and Chandra Reyna each worked to organize a symposium. And without the collective efforts of all 4 RAs, we would not have had the foundation upon which to execute the symposium series this semester. And I'm particularly thankful to Sydney Yarbrough and Chandra Reyna for their efforts to reorganize the symposium this semester and re-envision it as a series of panels. Before we begin, I also have a couple of logistical notes. This event will be recorded and posted to CRI's website for those who may not be able to stream it live. Please ask any questions of the speakers through the Q&A function of the webinar. We will also be reserving some time at the end for those questions. Also, if you are interested in tweeting about the event, please use the hashtag PJM20 and tag us at CRI. I now have the distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Gregory F. Ball, who serves as the Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, BSOS, at the University of Maryland, which oversees one of the largest and most academically challenging colleges at the university, with more than 6,000 undergraduate students and more than 800 master's and doctoral students. Under Dean Ball's leadership, BSOS initiated the Anti-Black Racism Initiative, which is led by Dr. Rashawn Ray, who's a sociology professor. The mission of this initiative is about elevate the status and experience of African Americans by supporting scholarship, teaching, and dialogues of all types and at all levels to fight against anti-Black racism in our society at the individual, structural, and cultural level. Dean Ball, as well as BSOS, has been supporters of the Parren J. Mitchell Symposium and its similar mission. We greatly appreciate his willingness to help us kick off the first panel in this series, and now the third and final panel of this series, which focuses on and continues our semester-long conversation examining the criminalization of people of color in their daily lives. Please welcome Dean Ball.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dow. And I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences to the final panel in the Parren J. Mitchell Symposium series. Our college is proud to support the symposium, now in its 7th year, and its mission in advancing the legacy of the late Congressman. We are at an important moment in our country's history where we have an opportunity to shape and transform policies that address ongoing racism and white supremacy. The panel series over the semester has given us an opportunity to take stock in how criminalization impacts communities of color and how we can begin to address racial inequality. Each year, the Critical Race Initiative celebrates Congressman Mitchell's legacy with a symposium focusing on a different topic related to racial inequality to increase awareness, consider possible solutions, and foster university-community relationships. The Critical Race Initiative is a group of scholars who center critical race theory as an essential framework through which to understand racial and ethnic inequality in society. This panel aims to explore how people respond to criminalization across the life course in various contexts. People may take proactive action in an attempt to avoid criminalization, building relationships with others who understand this experience, or try to mitigate the effects of criminalization through policy changes at an institutional level. I want to thank Associate Professor of Sociology, Dr. Dawn Dow, and PhD students Chanda Reyna, Sydney Yarborough, Simone Durham, and Robin Moore for their excellent work in organizing this symposium. We also appreciate the generous support from Singleton McAllister and Craig Thompson, two BSOS alumni, for supporting research collaborations between students and faculty. Finally, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us for the final panel of the Parren J. Mitchell Symposium series. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrea M. Lopez, an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Maryland and a member of the BSOS College. She's also Edward McJohnson Jr. Endowed Fellow, and she will be serving as the moderator for this panel. Dr. Lopez.
Thank you so much, Dean Ball, and thank you to Dr. Dell for those opening statements. It's an absolute privilege to be here today to work on the Parren J. Mitchell Symposium series, but also to be able to engage in this exciting discussion with our panelists today. So again, it's my honor, and also I have so much excitement to get to introduce our panelists. I won't say too much about them right now because our questions are going to facilitate that conversation, but you'll get to hear much more about them, and I'll try to insert some of the other things that I wanted to highlight as well. So our first panelist today is Dr. Nikki Jones. Dr. Jones is a professor of African American Studies at University of California, Berkeley. So then our second panelist is Marcus Bullock, CEO and founder of Flikshop, which you'll hear all about today on the panel. And then our final panelist is Uriel Serrano, doctoral candidate in sociology and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So just a few kind of logistic issues of how I will end up moderating this panel is that I will pose questions and then we'll kind of go around to each panelist. And roughly we're asking that each panelist keeps responses to about 3 minutes. And just to everyone in the audience today, there's going to be time for Q&A. So don't forget to submit your questions through the Q&A function. And then I'll remind you again later, just as a way to sort of generate more questions as we're sort of continuing on. But so these are all of our wonderful panelists, and I'm so excited. So we're going to go ahead and jump in to this discussion. And I guess I'll let you all decide who starts first. But I think a lot of these questions will end up sort of generating conversation between you all. So the first question is, could you tell us a little bit about your work and how you see communities of color responding to the various forms of criminalization in their lives? And as a little sub question, because we were kind of talking about intersectionality and intersectional approaches earlier, how does race, class, gender, and other social identities impact those experiences and responses? And happy to repeat those questions as we kind of cycle through the panelists. So I guess Dr. Jones, if you want to go first.
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone. Good morning. It's still morning out here. And just want to say I appreciate the invitation to be here and all the work that goes into, even though we're virtual on a virtual format, it still takes a lot of work to put something like this on. And so I'm really appreciative of all the effort that went into bringing us together this morning. So just to say a little bit about who I am, I'm a professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. I'm trained as a sociologist and a criminologist. And over the last 15 years, I've spent my career researching and writing about the impact of violence and policing and the criminal legal system on Black people, especially Black youth and Black communities. I've published 2 books, Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls in Inner City Violence, and The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption. And you'll see in that work and other work that I've done that my research and writing is informed by the Black intellectual tradition, by Black feminist traditions, by critical race theory and intersectionality. And I was saying before the call, can we still say that? Can we still say critical race theory? So I say yes, and certainly it informs my work. I've also conducted research on both sides of the dividing line. So I've done work with, on the side of policing, trying to get a sense of how policing as an institution sees Black communities, the logics that organize policing, but always with the experiences and the concern of Black communities at the center. And so work that values Black humanity, the value of Black life, and thinking about how all of this impacts Black communities. And so all of that will inform the conversation, what I share today. So the question about how Black communities respond to various forms of criminalization, we know that Black communities have done this since emancipation through the racial terror of Jim Crow into the post-civil rights era with the war on drugs and the wars on violence. And certainly if we think about the period of the last 5 years or so, with what we've seen in mass mobilizations. And when I talk to my students about what we've seen, in particular this last period of time, 5+ years, I try to get them to think about two groups, right? And how we've seen this response. And so the two groups, we could think of those who have grown up under the most oppressive criminal justice regime, right, in history, the most invasive when it comes to the presence, both physical and bureaucratic presence of the criminal legal system in Black communities. And these are the targets, right, of, and I'll just use one phase of the system, of policing, right? So we can think about the targets of that system, people whose adolescence is defined, is shaped by constant, routine, frequent interaction with the police and their communities, right? And then we can think about the watchers. And if we think about, for example, what happened post-Ferguson, where we saw these images of tanks rolling down the street and SWAT and police outfitted in SWAT gear, to folks in the neighborhood, that wasn't any surprise, right? That kind of response, that the police were capable of that kind of response. But to millions of people who are watching it on TV, they were shocked, right, to see that this is what policing was in America, and particularly at this time, and under, right, an administration that was much more progressive, right, than the current administration that we have now. And so you have these two groups, the targets, right, and the watchers. The targets of policing have resisted policing, have pushed back on it, right? For, as I was saying, for years, we think about this period in particular, from the rise of broken windows on, folks have been pushing back against it. Right. And then you had the watchers join them in the streets. And then we think about what happened this summer, right? We saw this mass mobilization, right? That was instigated by those who had the most frequent contact with the police, right? And that critical understanding of policing, and then others joining them in the streets, right? And so we think about the target population, we're thinking about Black and Latinx folks who are out there in the streets. And then we have a wider, white, or not wider, both wider and whiter group and multiracial group who are joining in that mass mobilization. And that's what we've seen over the course of the summer, where we've had what has been described as the largest mass movement against police violence and systemic racism in history, with millions and millions of people participating, somewhere between 15 and 25 million. And then we have this election where we saw Black folks, Native American folks, Latinx folks, right, rejecting, right, repudiating the law and order campaign, right, of the current president. And so you have to think about all of that as a mobilization against criminalization. And I'm sensitive to my time, and so I'll say this and then pass along to one of my panelists. And so we see this mass mobilization on a national scale. And if we look at the local level, we see work happening everywhere, right? We've seen legislation get passed over the last 6 months that hadn't gotten passed before then, right? We've seen local efforts at defunding. We've seen successful efforts, for example, here in Oakland, where I live in Oakland, California, to get cops out of schools. We've seen Black communities on the front lines and rethinking responses to mental health crises. And so the work that we are seeing, right? We have the national level. We know that Black communities are instrumental in that, and communities of color, right? National level, and we also have the local level, right? And when we think about the mobilization and the resistance and the pushing back against the criminalization of Black communities. So I'll stop there and pass it along.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Why don't we go over to Marcus Bullock? Do you want to take it next? And if you want me to repeat the question, I'm happy to.
No, I mean, I think I get a gist of, of what the question was, and I'm super pumped to be able to be here. To be here with you got the academic juggernauts who, I read about and who I admire. I'm super pumped. So if I come across as way too excited and hyped, then don't judge me. I'm just really excited. But I'm grateful for Professor Jones to point out a lot of the things she's saying in the community. One of the things I think that was very interesting to hear about, like how we saw what was going on around our country being reported and shown in the media, and then how like it was not foreign to so many people inside the communities where I lived in. But when the world began to see this, we started to see conversations begin to transform across the country. And it was interesting because I'm 38 years old. I'll be 39 next Saturday. And I promise you, I haven't talked about my Blackness this much in my entire life. It's interesting that this is happening, in these kinds of conversations, because while our company is being very thoughtful about building the technologies that help connect families to their incarcerated loved ones, just growing up inside of the communities that I grew up in, I have that background with my business, but also growing up in the communities I grew up in, and then myself going to prison as a child, I have a very unique experience that I think that gives an interesting perspective here, because what I've seen, across the journey and my peers and everyone who, in my immediate circle who looks like me, been forced to having to do the same thing the same things we all done, which is adapt, we learn, and we're agile about how we respond to a lot of inequalities that we see happening around our country. Unfortunately, we have to learn very swiftly, and we pray that our mental health is protected along the way, and just enough to be able to tell the next generation what success looks like once we make it through, whether or not we make it through or not. In my own personal life, I got sentenced for a carjacking that I committed when I was a 15-year-old kid to 8 years in adult maximum security prisons. And having my mom and my peers and my church members and my basketball team sitting in the courtroom to be able to hear this, as I had to learn new vocabulary words like consecutive and concurrent sentences and all of these kinds of things, when I didn't even understand what Miranda rights was. I didn't even know who Miranda was. Like, did you get the Miranda right? Who's Miranda? This was this is like not an uncommon story in the neighborhoods where I grew up. And so as I think about where the country has shifted in the conversations that are being had, I am excited about at least beginning to, have conversations that I've never had before, especially as I think about how criminalization, especially in the justice system, has lived in my life and those that look like me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'll insert my little pitch that if the participants yet have not seen Marcus Bullock's TED Talk, that you should absolutely do that. Easily Googleable, easily findable. So highly recommend that. Okay, so Uriel, we'll kick it over to you now to answer the same question.
Thank you, and good morning from the West Coast. First, also express my appreciation to all of you who, the work on back to get us all together and organize this virtual panel. And then also, like Marcus, if I sound too excited, it's because, we're in Dr. Nikki Jones, who guides so many of us, right, trying to think about policing and criminalization in the carceral state in our school, in a different context. And so I explore questions of masculinity, social movements, resistance, race, and neighborhood institutions in the context, right, of the carceral state and carceral violence. And I particularly ground my work in theories of intersectionality and Black feminist theory more broadly, youth studies, critical race theory, and carceral studies to examine, right, political mobilization by Black and Latinx youth, gender ideologies, carceral logics, and youth well-being in a inner city context. And so when I think about this question of how our community is responding, I've been lucky to work with, organize with, and research with youth organizations across the state and for the past 4 years. And then more recently, the Brothers on Selves Coalition in Los Angeles has been doing amazing work right around defunding school police and ending criminalization in LAUSD and LA County more broadly, and the state too, with coalitions like Youth Justice Coalition and a bunch of other orgs. And so I think one response I'll share that got me thinking while I was hearing all this is and then I'll just share one for now, right, for the sake of time, but this work around kind of individual and collective healing, right, that I'm seeing as so important as a response to criminalization, right? And it reminds me of Angela Davis, I forget where or at what point she talks about one thing we didn't do, right, maybe 40 years ago, was take that time to do that healing work, right? And so the way I see it with young people, especially with youth of color, right, that these healing practices as being very much part of the movement, right? And for various reasons, one, right, like the kind of, you know, they're witnessing and experiencing the brunt of criminalization, right? And when they're not experiencing it firsthand, they're witnessing it, right? But also using healing as a way to situate their trauma, right, or their traumatic experiences in a structural context, right, that recognizes the country's history of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and so forth. And so I see over and over again how these healing practices, right, allow the young people to reflect on their experiences, that of their communities, both in an individual but a structural context. And then that really inspires a lot of movement building, a lot of coalition building, right? Because there'll be cases when you hear youth who experience, you know, policing and criminalization through deportation, right? And then others who through policing and police brutality in South Central, for example, and you see them making these connections of how does, right, the deportation or connect to the police brutality we see in our neighborhoods, right? That's very much racialized. And then when I think about this question around race, class, and gender and how other social identities impact those experiences, I think my work and where I'm currently at is pushing me to rephrase that question to instead think about the country's history, right, of anti-Black chattel slavery, settler colonialism, racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and ableism, and their relationship in our understandings of criminalization, right? Because then, for example, the question becomes, how does criminalization rely on racism, sexism, ableism, and anti-queer logics, just to name a few, right? To animate, right? And that kind of question, I think, has been more useful for me, but also one that I've learned from the young people themselves, right? From the youth of color themselves responding to criminalization, right? When, for example, queer youth, right, constantly pushing us to think about how a lot of mental health institutions, right, that are using the logics of the carceral state to check up on them, right? and so I think that's where I'm at with that question of thinking less about how does race, class, and gender impact criminalization, but flipping the question around, right? How does criminalization rely on those anti-Black, right, anti-queer, and so on, ableist logics to criminalize communities, to criminalize young people. And so I think, yeah, a lot of my responses and a lot of what I'll be sharing today, it's definitely heavily informed by Black and Latinx youth across California and more specifically from South Central Los Angeles.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to switch up the order a little bit just to go back to Uriel, because this connects to exactly what you were just saying, and then we'll go back. But again, beaming with just this panel already, which is just so great and rich already. Uriel, so this kind of goes with what you said, but maybe I'll ask you to be a little bit more specific given all the work that you're currently engaged in. So again, given recent resurgence and protests related to racial justice and police reform that often have this high representation of young people, what can we learn from youth of color who have actively engaged in decriminalization efforts? So if you have any sort of specifics around that, I know you sort of were just digging into it, but if there's anything else you want to add.
Yeah. I love this question. I really do, because you know, to center youth in those ways. And then, you know, I think there's so many lessons, and I'm going to try to maybe 4, right, that I've been seeing so far, right. And the first, right, is the movement to defund school police, for example, that it must be youth-led and youth-centered, right? Like it just has to be. And I say that because the experiences of youth of color, right, render visible how carceral logics operate outside of places that are not explicitly punitive, like prisons and juvenile detention centers, right? Second, right, these efforts must be intersectional, like they just have to be, right? And here I think, you know, one thing that I've seen over and over is that young people recognize the insidious nature of the carceral state. And an intersectional approach then is attuned, right, to how criminalization produces difference as well as distinct yet structurally similar experiences, right? Here again, I'm thinking of the work of Dr. Jones, and who pushes us, right, to think about these things too in her books. And And then third, that abolition, so abolition is politics, right? The importance of them. But that abolition is also about shifting practices, right? That's one thing that's very clear to me from this work, is that the testimonies of youth of color, specifically Black and brown youth, right, that I've been working with, again, reveal that you don't need a prison or a police officer for criminalization to operate, for it to happen, right? And so time after time, I see Black and Latinx youth scrutinize the kind of over-reliance on carceral logics and practices of punishment, abandonment, dispossession. And I've heard my little sister, who's an organizer, who started doing some of this work when she was in high school on random searches. Other youth, right, constantly pushes to think, for example, how am I supposed to trust my teachers, right, if they're the ones searching me, right, randomly searching me, or kind of engaging in that process of criminalizing young people. And so, the third lesson for me is definitely that one, right, that abolition is also about shifting our practices. And I think the last one I'll share, and this is one of my favorite lessons, right, from the current kind of movement to defund school police, but also youth participation in youth and social movements, right, is that we must unapologetically center joy, music, right, dance, and healing, because the logics of the carceral state and the murderous agents are relentless, right, and exhausting. And so we have to be just as kind of relentless in that process, right, that as we work and we do this work to address criminalization, that we're also making sure to take care of ourselves. And there's somewhere where I talk about like the soundtrack of the movement, right? All these young people who spoken word, poems, releasing tracks, right, all throughout summer, that really center an abolitionist politic, right? But also open space to dance and to celebrate and to share space collectively.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, everything you're saying is making me think about how, the young people in my classes who are 18 to 22, they never let me forget that a radical politic includes pleasure at every turn, right? And that means something very specific in terms of abolitionist work as well for them. So, so thank you so much for that. Okay, so maybe let's go back to Marcus Bullock for the same question. So again, what can we learn from youth of color who are actively engaged in decriminalization efforts?
One of the things that I'm most excited about is how we're learning that what has been interpreted as more radical behavior by the media are the real triggers for change, and what that's going to take in order to be able to see change across the country. I mean, we saw it, even over the last several months, obviously about what's happening in the country. And I think that, we had certain pieces of the protests in previous conversations around racial inequities or police brutality or any of these, but it literally took a perfect storm of like COVID plus, George Floyd and all these things that happened for us to really shift the conversation, not in just outside of our communities and NPOs that support it and in academia, but even in our corporate spaces and enterprises really driving capital in the world that ultimately helps drive a lot of conversation. So I think that seeing that like what's been interpreted as radical behavior in the streets in the community is the real trigger for change. So I think that's the first thing that I'm just personally excited about seeing, and how the country's adjusting to learning that that's what it's going to take in order for us to be able to see some shift. But one of the things that as Uriel pointed out, that the young people they must sit at the table when ideating around some of these solutions. I mean, I've seen firsthand how leveraging my own experiences to create narrative change in a world that really can't see how younger leaders are shifting conversation can really do it, right? Being able to be one of the ones that say, hey, look, openly, I made a horrible decision in my life. And as a result of the decision that I made, and going to prison as a child, growing up in prison, going through puberty in prison as a result of like the laws that were being passed back in the mid 90s when I was being called a super predator, and I had to be like, yo, lock them up and throw away the key. Like, I had to go through that firsthand to understand about how I can leverage that own story to one, create Flikshop, right? So now we created a impactful business that can contribute back to this conversation, but then leveraging that now new business and having, a sexy tech company to be able to be, and being a CEO of that, to leverage my own story to be able to help create narrative change, right? I mean, I'll tell you, like using how these us young users are, us young leaders are leveraging tech to be able to scale new ideas, how we're using art to paint pictures of the possibilities of, or tell the stories of our community, even through music. Like, these are the new ways of how we're changing the world. And I'm excited to be able to see what's going to happen, because I think that this is where ideas really scale, especially when in the new environment where social media is snowballing a lot of these efforts, and younger people are taking up the ranks on it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Dr. Jones, same question to you. What can we learn from youth of color who are actively engaging in decriminalization efforts?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to build on Uriel's and Marcus's comments, because I so appreciate how they bring youth into the center, right? And so often when we're talking about policing, we are thinking that we're talking about the policy of the criminal justice system or the criminal legal system. But when we think about the content, who has the most frequent contact with the police, that's young people age 16 to 25, right? The most frequent contact with the police. And so any policy on policing is youth policy. Right. And so we should be thinking about what's good for young people, right? Not how, within a paradigm primarily of law enforcement, right? And so that's something that I've tried to kind of push people to think on over the course of my career, to get other people outside of law enforcement to understand what's at stake when you have police and other actors in the criminal legal system interacting with young people. What do we want for our young people? So one of the things that I've learned from my work and thinking about what do we learn from young people is also what do we learn with young people, right? And so what do we learn by standing with young people, standing alongside young people? And I can think about, times when I've done this in my life, just showing up to court with a young person, and you just see the entire system just kind of tilt their head a little bit, right? Marcus is laughing, right? So what's this person, right, with this status doing with this kid, right? And it shows you two things. It shows you how the system is set up to operate like a machine and to treat young people, young Black people, like objects, right? And there are labels and logics that allow that to happen with shocking efficiency, right? And the consequences that, Marcus just shared the consequences of that for him as a young person. Even with the mistake that he made, a system could have responded differently to that if a system was primarily concerned about that young person, his life, and helping him to make better decisions and not purely a punishment. All right. And so what do we learn from getting in the way? And then what do we learn from asking the question, what does safety look like, right, from the perspective of a young person who's a frequent target? What does security look like? What does well-being look like in their home, in the neighborhood, in their schools, right, out in the world? And when we ask that question, the role of the criminal legal system and the role of the police in particular diminishes, because we know that those aren't the institutions that deliver that, right? Those aren't the institutions that are charged with delivering that. And so the best that we can do when it comes to working within those paradigms is to reduce harm, perhaps, right? But what we want to be doing is building up other institutions in non-criminalized, who can respond in non-criminalizing ways, to pick up on Uriel's point about how these criminalizing logics can migrate into other institutions. Right, so we want institutions that are focused on non-criminalization, building up well-being, building up the capacity of young people and their communities, and in their homes and the people in their lives. And so, standing with young people, learning from young people, right, and learning with them, looking out in the world from their perspective and asking that question is just so important.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Just a reminder to all the participants to submit your questions in the chat. So go ahead and do that, and then we'll be able to sort of work through them as we leave time at the end to do so. Okay, so moving right along. So I'm going to go back to Uriel for this one. So recently in the public discourse, there have been attempts to envision alternatives to the current criminal justice system, such as reforming and restructuring law enforcement, defunding the police, and also prison abolition. So what are your thoughts on these different ideas about addressing historical and ongoing criminalization for groups of color?
Like I said, Black and Brown youth are my sounding board, right? And the song that I'm hearing from them is one of police and prison abolition, right? And so that's what I'm committed to, right? And that's where I want to be, right? That's the hill I'm going to climb, and that's the hill I'm going to stay on. and I say this for a couple of reasons, right? During the summer, during the uprisings and when the kind of defunding the school police movement here in LA was taking off, right? One of my, young comrades, right, released a song, "Why do we need school police," right? And really asking that question throughout the song, why do we need school police, right? And throughout the song, right, kind of questioning, right, like kids fight and the police just makes it worse, right? Kids fight and they end up with a record, instead of like counseling, right? Instead of, all these other things that they need, right? And so one is for me, right, that the importance of thinking about prison abolition and police abolition, and here I'm speaking right to the schooling context, for example. It's part of it, right, has to a lot do with what we've been talking about, that these logics are just operating so rampantly, right? And they're seeping in and spilling over to so many institutions, right? I think of the work of right, homie Brianna Harvey, right, who talks about like, the foster care system, right, and its carceral logics and how it deploys them, right? But also I think about these moments, right, for example, with LAUSD, that LAUSD, Los Angeles Unified School District, has the second largest police force in the country, right? And at one point, they owned 3 grenade launchers, 61 M16 rifles, and a tank, right? And it was because of community organizing that they got rid of these things, right? And so one just kind of started asking the same question that the youth are asking: why do we need school police, right? And then I think one of the things that has been really interesting about this summer that we also saw, I think, right, we could also see the limits of police reform in the conversations around defunding the police, right? And so I think a lot about, I'm working on a project with my colleague Andrea Carmen Vasquez, right, when we're thinking about how do these, so the school board, for example, right, invoking these conversations around safety and protection to justify the need for school police, right? But always doing so at the expense of Black youth, right? And so despite Black youth going up time over time, right, for decades now in LAUSD and testifying against punitive practices, against policing, against the presence of police, right, and criminalization, they invoke these notions of safety and protection, right? We got to protect our schools, we got to keep our youth safe, always at the expense of Black youth. And you see how folks' carceral imaginations, right, operate, where some of the school board members, for example, and this is, one of the things that we're working together, and we're looking at multiple school boards now, right, in the same conversation, the same rhetoric, where you see, for example, that police are like, well, if police are that bad in your schools, let's put them in civilian clothes so they're not as scary, right? As if the uniform alone is the only thing that facilitates that process of criminalization, trauma, right, and carceral logics. Or solutions like, let's put them in your community, right? Right, let's add, right, it's as if these communities weren't already over policed and criminalized, right? Especially in like poor inner city neighborhoods, right, and rural areas. Like, well, let's put them in your community instead, right? Let's put school police to already, communities overpopulated. We're here in LA, right? LAPD and all the, so forth. And so for me, right, like their call for abolition and to defund the police, right, is one that addresses the presence of police, but also, like I've been saying, right, the logics that come with it, right? I remember being at a meeting with a bunch of youth, and they're like, we're talking about getting ready for these kind of moments, right, when we're going to go up to a school board and these protests, and we're having a conversation about like what scares you, like what is it about policing that has us on edge? And somebody's saying, right, like I'm at the point where what scares me the most is that these logic, right, this criminalization happens even when police are not present in our schools, right? And what's also scary about this moment, right, if you look at a lot of these conversations and police unions and officers coming in to defend their role in school districts, they're oftentimes claiming that they need to be there because they fill roles that they have no business being part of, right? that they function as social workers, that they're counselors, that they're this, that they're that. And it's like, no, right? You have no business doing any of that work. So when I think about defunding and the police and police abolition, and especially in the schooling context, right? Youth are simply telling us, like, we know what we need and it's not police. right? It's other resources. It's another way of viewing schooling and reimagining schools so they're not these punitive and carceral spaces.
Can I just add something to Uriel's comment? Because you bring up a really important, I think can be a logic that can sometimes be a barrier to abolitionist alternatives. And that is this logic, this narrative that they want the police, right? So there are people in the schools who want the police. There are people in the neighborhood who want the police. Black people want the police, right? And when you get closer to that, you understand the complexity of what people are really asking for, that the kind of policing that people are imagining is a kind of policing that has never existed in the history, right, of this land, right, first. And then when you actually get, close to the young people who are the targets of policing, they will say, what do I want? I want safety. I want security. And I know the police better than anyone because I interact with them the most, and I know they don't deliver it. They don't keep me, in fact, safe from violence at the hands of peers, and they don't keep me safe from violence at the hands of the police either. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Marcus, did you want to jump in on this one next?
This is awesome. I mean, I love this conversation. I mean, reallocating funds has definitely become a wildly popular topic for strategy, and prison abolition is at the top of my personal list because I honestly believe that there are other alternatives to incarcerating my friends and my family members simply because that's always that's always been a trend to do in my neighborhood, and we have to get rid of that trend. But how we also see funding trickle down to the grassroots organizations and businesses is where I think that we really see impact. I'm a firm believer that policy decisions are made at the dinner table. So my job is to help influence the dinner table conversation so that we can at least see what the possibility of abolition looks like. I believe you can't create or redesign a new world that you can't see. And so I like to be able to leverage this story to be able to show that. And in fact, if you give me one or 2 minutes, I would like to give you that personal story. So let's narrow down to what I mean when I talk about what a new level of love and support can create when we, begin looking at these solutions around defunding police. And again, going back to Uriel's comment about bringing people that are mostly impacted to the conversation as when we come up with these solutions. But when in 1996, when I went to prison, I'm in a courtroom, I'm getting sentenced to 8 years. My brain can't even really wrap myself around what was happening in that courtroom when it happened. In fact, there's a quote in my transcripts of me, when I read it as an adult, I'm like, Marcus, really, dude? But, I tell the judge, I look at the judge in the middle of my sentencing. I just got sentenced to 23 years to life, 15 years suspended, and 8 years to serve, but I had to serve all 8 in adult maximum security prisons because I was a super predator and I needed to be able to be with the monsters. And I looked at my judge and I'm like, Your Honor, I just got moved up to varsity. I'm in 10th grade and we're getting ready to go to the state championships for my basketball team. And I would like to go play in a championship, then we can come back and reevaluate what's happening right there. And my judge looks at me like, young man, you have no idea of what's really happening to you right now. So I'm gonna allow your lawyer to explain that to you in the holding tank while I call this new case. And that was my entrance to what the justice system looked like from a judge who looked at me and knew that I was too young to be able to understand what was happening, but still felt that it was okay to send a 15-year-old to be with adults, where my best friend was my cell partner who had life plus 43 years in prison. Now, as my brain began to decay and I began to, drive my own self crazy with this new reality, knowing that while I should be graduating from high school, I had several more years to be able to serve inside a prison. My mom saw the hopelessness and depression that was beginning to be created during that time. And my mom made a promise to me in a prison visiting room when I believed that my life was over. And she promised me and said, Marcus, I am going to write you a letter or send you a picture every day for the remaining 6 years of your prison sentence. I'm 17 years old, and my mom's telling me she's going to send me a bunch of Polaroids and some sandwiches and some stuff. And I'm like, what are you talking about? When those slamming doors go clanking shut, my whole life completely changes. And my mom had to wrestle with knowing that she couldn't even emote with her son in a visiting room The only thing she could do was write him letters and send him pictures. So my mom did that for the remaining 6 years of my life until I was released in 2004, when I came back home to the community and I knew I wanted to figure out a way to be able to jump back into the community and contribute back. Now, eventually it landed with me being able to leverage a job opportunity to start a small business that gave me enough revenue to be able to Google how to build a mobile app to be able to now create Flikshop, where we connect over 170,000 families around the country. When we've connected all these families in very demonstrable ways, allowing it to be very affordable for the other family members who would typically become prey to that same system that has been charging folks $18, $19, $20 for a 15-minute phone call and other predatory ways to be able to keep it connected in prison. Now, the only way I was able to come up with that solution, and this is my silver lining of me going to prison, was that I was one of the ones who actually had the lived experience to develop a technology that will allow us to be able to create a scalable way for us to reduce recidivism using a cell phone. Now, I wouldn't have been able to do that without the love and support of my mom and all of the people who poured into me along the journey, which completely illustrates that there isn't a lack of talent inside of these communities, but there is typically there's a lack of access. And if we figure out a way to be able to solve that access problem and figure out ways to be able to reallocate funding in spaces that allow for the next legion of Marcuses to come out and create these world-changing opportunities for us to all be able to become a part of, that's when we see change. And I think that once we understand that these are real people inside of these spaces that live in these communities that are wanting to build real solutions, we're going to see something interesting. And I think that when, as we have conversations around what reallocating funds look like, here's one success metric to show you that it does work.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm just checking time, and I think we're good for now until I'm told otherwise. So another question I'll pose, and let's go to Uriel first. So based on your work, what would you suggest in terms of policies to address ongoing processes of criminalization? And I think that can be in either, and this is my little editorialization, but I think that can be in either the sort of radical imagining of that, or in the sort of ways in which you're sort of working within the constraints of these institutions that are historically punitive. So I'll let you take it whichever way you prefer.
One thing that I think about, right, and I don't remember if it was Savannah Shange or at another panel, somebody was like, are we ready to abolish the police in our heads, right? And it's a really important conversation, right? Because as we think about policy, I would think about policy formation. It's like, what work do we also got to do, right? Collectively and with ourselves, right, to abolish the police in our heads, right? Because again, when I was talking about the limits of police reform in schools district, right, it was very clear, like these moments are very clear examples of adults, right, that their imagination is completely taken over by the carceral state, right? That all solutions and things that they were suggesting as alternatives to what the young people are demanding all has some kind of underlying carceral logic, right, operating there. And so I think about that, right, about as we think about policy formation, right, we also got to do that work of addressing and recognizing, right, the kind of insidious nature of carceral logics and how they operate in our everyday. And then, I'll go based off of, in LA, we've a lot of youth orgs and doing amazing projects and research, collecting their own data, right, on their experiences with policing and safety. And so, for example, like I said, the Brothers Themselves Coalition being one of those. And they've been releasing reports, right, with their findings around these experiences. And these are reports and findings that the school district, I just want to be very clear, right, has rejected, right? Instead, they've relied on research from people, faculty or a few professors from UCLA who studied police officers and asked them about their experiences and how they see themselves. But one of the things that they do in these reports is outline a couple things that they want, right, in order to decriminalize. And so I'll highlight a few of those. And the first one, right, is eliminating contact between law enforcement and communities of color, and at the very minimum, youth in schools, right? Like just that contact alone needs to stop, right? And that includes, right, their vision includes take all these cops off of school stops, right? Why are they at the bus stop? Why is there a police officer there all the time, right? Right now we're in a pandemic, and so youth are not commuting as much to school, right? But those are also moments where a lot of our young people were being policed and criminalized, not having enough money to go to school, and so therefore jumping on the bus, right? I know there's an org out here who's asking for free bus passes for all youth, right? All young people, so that they could avoid these experiences with criminalization, where their poverty, right, is being penalized and criminalized. You know, their demands around restorative and transformative justice frameworks, right? That's really important in the work and thinking about the implementation of these practices in schools, right? And again, kind of building on Marcus and the kind of conversation we're having, right, is the reallocation of resources, right? Moving away from punishment and abandonment to mental health support, right? To social emotional development, to professional development, you know, to academic enrichment. And so at the core of what I'm saying, right, and I think and what I'm saying is all informed by the young people themselves, is fund youth futures, right? That's literally one of the kind of calls from brothers themselves, right? It's like fund youth futures, right? And that means a multitude of things, right? And one of the nice things, though, that I think for me about thinking about policy in conversation with youth organizing and a lot of organizing groups is that the work is already happening, right? That the work is already happening in our communities, right? Folks already have tools and practices, maybe at a smaller scale, that we could definitely build on and learn from and with to create policy, right? But I think for me, right, at the core, right, of policy formation, I really love that, like what you said, Dr. Jones, about any police policy is youth justice policy, right? Because it's true. It's definitely true. And I think the young people, right, when they say fund youth futures, are picking up on that, right?
Yeah, that's right. If I can just
please. I was going to say too. Yeah, please do, please.
Yeah, and to Uriel's point, you know, that young people are already out there doing this. And so one of the things that I love about this moment, and I try to remind folks about this moment, is that no one needs anyone's permission to dream, right? To dream a better world for themselves and their communities and the people that they love with. And people are out there doing it. They've been doing it. I think people don't understand that some of these campaigns are years-long campaigns that young people get involved in. They imagine a 5-year, a short-term, a long-term, and a longer term, right? They are strategic about the work that's getting done. And it's work that is wrapped up in the Black freedom struggle, right? In the long struggle for Black freedom. It's work that's wrapped up in what Angela Davis describes, building on the work of W.B. Du Bois, as abolition democracy. In our department in African American Studies, my colleagues, Eula Taylor, Tiana Paschel, and Lee Rayford, and our faculty, we are leading an abolition democracy initiative over the next couple of years that will help to have continue some of these critical conversations, understanding that emancipation wasn't enough, right? What was necessary was the building up of democratic institutions that could actually guarantee racial equality after the end of slavery, and certainly after the failure of Reconstruction. And we're still in that project of building those institutions up, and young people recognize that, and that's what they're asking for, and they have ideas about what these institutions should look like. I think for me, and we don't have enough time to get into it now, but I could think about my own evolution from progressive reform to police abolition, and understanding with conviction now the necessity of police abolition, and in part because I appreciate through the work I've done the limits of reform. Even with the best of intentions, the most progressive of police chiefs who understand the history of racial injustice, the institution itself is not capable of the kinds of social transformation and structural transformation that is needed, right? There will always be an outer limit of what is possible. There is work that can be done within that limit. I think that we should be attuned to the fact that some reforms just allow the institution to operate more efficiently. And if we understand policing as policing scholars have said, as an efficient means to deliver force, to deliver violence. Violence is central to policing. Without the violence, it's not policing. Right. And so if you understand that as the paradigm, there are ways to limit that. And I think that people have begun to move that forward. Things like limiting, and accountability is an umbrella where this can exist. So limiting or ending qualified immunity, putting restrictions on use of force, pushing back against police unions. We know that police unions are correlated, right, with actual increased violence or more reports of officers who use violence, right? And so if officers have the protection and the backing of the union, they have more freedom and more protection when it comes to violence. There perhaps was some hope of restoring some of the Fourth Amendment protections that have been eroded over the last several decades. I don't know that that's as possible now with the new composition of the Supreme Court, but that means that cities and police departments have to do as much as possible in order to reduce the potential of officers to deliver in policing to deliver harm, either direct harm or indirect harm. But we have to understand that even with all that, that's not the solution. And that's why abolition is exciting, right? That's why, abolition, people, for folks who are coming into this, and certainly over the course of the summer, I think people were fearful and can remain so of the conversation around defunding, because they think of it as a destructive enterprise. And, for some folks it is, right? They want to tear down, we saw that. They wanted to tear down the police station, right? And that's real. And there are folks who've been in this work for a long time who understand it as a process and are drawn to it because of the generative nature of the work, because of the building up of relationships and new systems of relations, of transformation. And that is certainly what brings me and keeps me in this space firmly rooted now.
Thank you so much. So Marcus, did you want to add anything to that before we start going to a question from a participant?
No. This is all good stuff. I'll just be being redundant.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, so I'm going to pose a very interesting question again for us to sort of think about what it means to operate within institutions that are inherently criminalizing, that are inherently punitive, that are inherently violent. That's my editorialization. Just sort of thinking about that a lot in terms of even the reproduction of higher education, et cetera, right? So this person asked, so this is Lily's question, so thank you so much for posing this question. So as an aspiring prosecutor and a recent UC Berkeley graduate with a certificate in carceral geographies, I'm interested to hear our panelists' position on the responsibility, role, or privilege of prosecutors to reimagine our carceral landscape. So a big, juicy question. So
before the academics jump in and really give us, real raw solutions, one of the things I'm super excited about that is one of the things, this question here, one of the things I've been paying a lot of attention to is prosecutorial reform. In fact, one of my best friend and co-defendant at the time, Reginald Betts, he wrote a piece for the New York Times a few weeks ago. It was titled Kamala Harris, Mass Incarceration and Me. And he talked about him, his mom, and he and I going to court and what that meant for some of my best friends who were in prison. If you haven't checked that out, definitely go check out that piece or listen to the podcast. It was really, really dope. But, I think it was interesting because one of the things that he talked about there, and Dwayne and I talk about it a lot on calls, are, how there's an interesting juxtaposition for young people who want to feel safe in their communities that Professor Jones talked about, where they want to feel safe in their communities and their schools, while they also want to free themselves of the criminalization of poverty. And one of the solutions that I think that I'm excited about seeing with the more progressive districts that are asking their prosecutors and court officials to actually find creative ways to be more a part of the community and jump in there and have real conversations. As I think is because you can't be a part of a community that you can't see and you don't feel like you're a part of. And for too long, me and my friends, we just didn't feel like we were a part of this new system. And even as we think about what reforms need to be, I'm grateful to see the prosecutors that are very thoughtful and attentive about wanting to jump in there with these reforms. That's going to be very important. And sorry for my motion lights, and I'm not moving, so my lights went out.
No problem. Uriel, do you want to respond to that next?
I'll let Dr. Jones.
Well, Marcus, I'm glad you started because I was going to defer to you anyway. With your wisdom. And, I know folks out there know that academics, we have a certain position, but what I love about this moment is how much I'm learning from folks who are intellectuals and scholars, inside the academy, but outside the academy, out there doing the work. And I think that that wisdom is necessary in the way that you both have spoken to. So I get questions like this from students often, and especially by the time I'm done with my course. I teach a course called Criminal Justice in the Community, and we go through the history of the criminal justice system. And then you have students there who are like, oh, but I wanted to go into the system and make a change. And there are a couple different ways I respond to it. One, I lean on the work of Audre Lorde, and she says, when I use my strength in service of my vision, it matters not whether I'm afraid. And so I tell each person, know what your strength is, right? And know what your vision is, right? And imagine ways to get there, where you are, and the settings in which you are. And at the same time, understand the limitations of those settings, right? And that institutions, by and large, are more successful at changing people than people are at changing institutions, right? Not that it can't happen, but there's a deep institutional investment in getting people in those institutions to think and do the work of maintaining the institution. And so even with the most progressive of ideals, you will be wrapped up into that work. And I can say that in some of the work that I've done on campus, and trying to push back against the expansive, the expansion of policing, is being, the challenge of being in that limited kind of logic, and can feel oppressive. And so depending on where you end up, you will feel that oppression. And then the question is, if you can withstand that, what power do you have? What space can you carve out? Could you imagine yourself having the power to respond differently to a young Marcus, right? That will matter for Marcus's life, right? For the young Marcuses out there. Will it change the institution? It will take much more than that to change the entire institution. And so what we see with the progressive prosecutor movement is, an understanding of the politics of this as well. And so district attorneys are elected, and elected officials do what it is they were elected to do. And so if there is, and I think in some places there is now, a call for elected officials to be responsive in the way that Marcus just said, then you will have, right, these locales where that kind of thing may be happening. But again, you take a step out and understand that this is an institution with deep roots, right, that has been central in the process and project of criminalization and racial inequality, in sustaining a system of racial inequality. And so it is going to take more than that, and you will likely feel the weight of that. And at the same time, if you are able to do that work within the system, you may make some serious change that matters for people who are coming through that system right now. And that's just the tension I think that folks have to live with.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Jones. We have a couple of questions, so I'm going to pose this next one.
Oh no, Andrea.
Yeah. Okay, I'll play moderator.
There we go.
Oh wait, no, Professor Dow, you jumping in? Okay.
Hi, I will jump in to ask a question. Let me just take a quick look. So a question came up that's talking about, thanking all the amazing panelists for their work and sort of building on something that Uriel spoke about in terms of the work that youth are doing and organizing communities. And this is from Brianna Hari, asking how we as scholars can build a bridge between research and practice to uplift what is being done instead of recreating the wheel, right? So this is, I guess, you can start off with you, Uriel, but then others can please add your responses as well.
Ooh, it's such a good question. And I think like we can have a whole panel just on that question, right? About the researcher or academics and our role in the community. Because one thing that I learned this summer is that we could also be very much we could also be a tool of the carceral state, right? And that was very obvious to me at the LAUSD school board meetings when you had these faculty from UCLA who did focus groups, right, with police officers, and then pulled up and were like, this is how they socially, emotionally support all the young people. And I'm like, whoa, you didn't even talk to the youth, but here you are, okay. But, you know, so before I keep, you know, let me not go down that route. But you know, and so these kind of last 4 years have taught me a lot, or constantly pushed me to reflect on this question, right? And I think it's a really multi-layered conversation, right? We could think about publishing, right? That sometimes the work, right, needs to come out now, right? Folks needed the work to be out yesterday. How does publishing, right, block that process, but in terms of research, and I think I'll ask this for grad students, right? Or PhD students who are figuring out, right, what they're going to do in their projects, and if it's going to be community. It takes a lot of work, right? It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of co-building that is not acknowledged, recognized, or valued by the academy yet, right? Or I don't know if it ever will be, right? But one of the things about community engaged research that I've learned, right, that it's always good to go, if you're gonna be doing this work with folks, right, to take that step back and think, what are the pressing questions that people have, and how could I support that, right? Because oftentimes it's the reverse, and folks want to come in, here's my questions, right? Here are my kind of, this is the way I want to push theory and do all these things. I got a big old grant, check me out with my, you know, Robert Wood Johnson, and let me do this work the way I want it, right? And folks sometimes don't need that, right? That's not the work that they need. And so it's always, you know, at the very basic, taking that step back and be like, what questions do you have? What do you need in the now, right? I've seen so many times where researchers come in and 4 or 5 years later be like, by the way, here's a report I wrote on the research that I did on your organization, right? Or on your community. And folks being like, it's a great report that we needed 5 years ago when we were at the LAUSD trying to convince them that our work mattered, right? And so I think a lot about that, right? About kind of how do we redefine our kind of very traditional roles as researchers. And one of those ways is to take a step back and also think about the kind of questions and work that folks need in the community, right? Not what you need as the scholar who read the literature or who wants to fill in the gaps, right? Or push theory, but it's just simply like, what questions do you have? Right? How could I be of service to you in this process? And take it from there, right? Integrate it into your work, or, you know, and then the work just starts to, you know, yeah.
Yes, I really appreciate those comments about the idea of engaging scholars and with the people that they're studying in a way that's more on an equal level. And so I'm curious what other people's thoughts are, and you know, having the needs of the communities we study really shape and guide our research. Other thoughts from Dr. Jones or Marcus Bullock, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, I love that the point Uriel made, because it resonates with the question that I ask when I go into the field is, how can I be of service, right? How can I be of service? And understanding that, you know, you have a whole agenda, just like Uriel just said, you have a whole agenda, but that is not necessarily, that's not the agenda of folks in the field, right? In the community. And so asking yourself that at different points, and you know, if you're doing the work of you know, scholarly work, at least for me, understanding that sometimes in order to be of service, I need to take some space and time to learn more, and that's where the study and the deliberation comes in, and the writing comes in. Sometimes, you know, you just need to do that to be of better service to people. And so, you know, that question certainly guided me in my last project and the work that I presented in the chosen ones, and some of the service that I did, I never wrote about, right? It was just work that was needed to be done in the community, and I was positioned to help in that way. And now I'm thinking about, as someone who's not in, you know, doing field work right now, how can what I've learned over the course of my career be of service? And I think that there are different ways that can happen. I'm working with an organization, with an interdisciplinary group of students on campus, and an organization, Anti-Police Terror Project, right now, trying to build up that relationship and asking the question, what kind of research do you need? Already understanding that this organization has been on the front lines of a successful campaign, right, over the last, so sometimes we can overestimate how much organizations need academics, right, and need us. And so we should be, you know, we should ask the question, what value, what service can we provide that will be useful for you in moving your work forward. But I think at any point, just ask that question, how can I be of service, and listen to the answer, whether it's your own answer or from what you're getting from the community, that will help point you in the right direction.
Marcus, anything you'd like to add?
I love this. I love, when we're talking about weaving people in that know it the best, like that's the best, right? Like, I mean, we had when wardens were looking forward to figuring out ways to be able to solve a problem with getting, prevent fentanyl from getting inside of these prisons, so that which were causing overdoses of these different drugs inside of prisons. Like, one of the executive directors of the Department of Corrections in Colorado specifically, they called us and said, hey, how should we do this, Marcus? Our senior TED Talk, and I realized you've been in prison and you're being thoughtful about building technology to be able to help us, but also families are complaining about calls and tablets, and they can't afford it, or it's not accepted in every one of the facilities. How do we solve this problem? And we were able to give them a real solid solution that allowed for them to be able to keep hundreds of thousands of families across the state connected, which was incredible, right? We didn't even realize there was that many people incarcerated amongst their jails, prisons, and then a new immigration facility that was there inside of Colorado. It was incredible what they learned from that. But I think that what was interesting along that journey was that we were able, because we knew the solution that we wanted to be able to build, we knew that we needed to work with academia to help understand the data and the science, the metrics and the analytics around the solution that we were building for Colorado, to be able to help detail what the solution can look like at scale. And so we engaged with Dr. Ray over at University of Maryland Sociology Department while they were working on a technology around virtual reality to help contribute to what police reforms could look like. We were in after that consultation with them and bringing them into the project, to the solution. Like Dr. Jones talks about, we were able to work now in tandem with creating another solution, leveraging a technology that they already had and repurposing it for a solution that we wanted to be able to bring inside of this space. And this is an example of how, Dr. Ray didn't say, hey, we already have something that we're working on and we have a solution that we want to introduce to you. But we want to work in tandem with what you guys think that the right solution should look like. And maybe we can repurpose it and aggregate a bunch of data and metrics to help inform your decisions moving forward. And this is a clear example of how it wasn't like, let's take over and figure out how we can leverage what we've done, but how can we work side by side. And I'm always grateful to hear us think about being thoughtful, especially academia, how we can contribute, especially to people who already started to build these solutions.
Great, thank you so much for those thoughtful comments. And I want to say that we're at time, and I want to be respectful. I know people have to get to classes and elsewhere. I kind of don't want this conversation to start. I have a number of questions of my own that I would love to ask, but I want to end this series, but I want to also invite Dr. Lopez to turn her camera back on, because I want to thank all the panelists. If she can, I see her there, but I'm not sure if she can turn it on. But if not, I want to just say that I really thank all the panelists and the moderator for their time and their wisdom and their efforts to connect this research to the topic that we're talking about today. It's been an honor for me to be a part of this session over the course of the semester, where we've talked about the continuity of criminalization from schools to streets to prisons along 3 different panel themes: criminalization in daily life, unequal treatment and enforcement, and now responses and solutions. And I'm really happy that we ended on this note of thinking about the pushing back and the solutions and the ways that communities are responding to this criminalization and the agency those communities have in trying to direct going forward. So I want to thank all of our panelists over the course of the semester. This has been a very enriching and robust set of conversations. I also want to let people know that in the coming semester, while we're ending this part of the Parren J. Mitchell Symposium series, we are in the next semester, we'll be partnering with the Reparations series for one of their sessions talking about the social science aspects of reparations. And so we encourage you to look out for the announcements about that series. The Reparations series, which I'm also a part of, will be going on in the next semester to talk about various components of reparations. And so I welcome you all to come to those series. And I also encourage you to come to Critical Race Initiative's website. If you were not able to attend previous talks, we have the YouTube videos of them up online, so you can please take advantage of them for your classes or for your own personal viewing. I want to end this by saying thank you to the research assistants who spent a key role in helping to organize this, to Sydney Yarbo Arena from the semester. And I want to thank all the co-sponsors across the campus who have lent their support to us with resources and just extending the information about these symposiums to your community. I hope you guys all have a wonderful afternoon. And I hope that this conversation today has enriched your own intellectual soul and emotional soul in the way that it has enriched mine. Have a good afternoon.